Well, for more on retro gadgets making a comeback, let's bring in Marlene Morris Towns. Marlene is an adjunct professor of marketing at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start by talking about some of the industries that are essentially coming back from the dead and why they're making a comeback.
Well, I think that nostalgia is such a great way to sell products, and it, in a way, brings together the generations. It can kind of close the gap for older consumers, and I'll say older meaning 40s, 50s, which is not really older, but older generations. It's just nostalgic. It reminds them of a simpler time. And then for younger generations, your preteens, tweens, millennials, it's something new and novel that they've discovered. So in a way, it appeals to both segments at the same time, but in very different ways.
So then how are some of these brands marketing themselves so that you have the older generation who remembers the brand, and then you have a new generation who doesn't have that nostalgia because they just weren't around at the time? How do they market to them?
Well, I think it's really interesting how they manage to speak to these two segments at the same time, but in different ways. They'll reach them in different ways. You'll have younger consumers that will find them in stores like Urban Outfitters and stores that target the younger consumers. So they'll see them in retail settings. Older consumers, a lot of times will see them on their kids' television stations being advertised or in stores and oftentimes where they're watching, so on networks that are targeting parents of kids as well.
Now, we did have some industries that almost died, but somehow still managed to hang on. Which are some of the older industries that are still hanging on?
One like Polaroid that was mentioned in the clip is a big one that, you know, with the camera industry evolving, the photography industry, and people are taking digital pictures, they've managed to make a comeback. Probably no small coincidence that the song that references them, so, you know, when Big Boy says shake it like a Polaroid picture, you had lots of young consumers that were listening to this music that had no idea what that meant until it was explained to them. Another one that comes to mind is frozen yogurt. So if you remember in the 80s, 70s, 80s, TCBY was a really big yogurt brand, and you could go find them in any retail setting. And they really kind of faded out in the 90s, and the frozen yogurt industry made a big comeback in the 2000s, really. It became a little bit more boutique, a little bit more upscale, and it had the self-serve aspect that we didn't have before. So then people can go in and serve themselves, they can put on toppings, and it really kind of gained a new popularity in a younger segment. And for older consumers who remember it from back in the day, it's just a nostalgic thing to do when you go to the beach or the mall or what have you.
Now, I can just imagine if you're Blockbuster seeing all the success of Netflix. I mean, they must be kicking themselves. They essentially were the Netflix of back in the day. Talk about some of the mistakes that some of these older industries made in terms of really keeping up with consumers' changing tastes.
I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the mistakes that companies or brands make is not looking ahead at what's coming down the pike, looking at how people are living, how people are consuming things like entertainment and things like that, and really trying to stay ahead of the curve and not just focusing on what it is that we provide, which is movies, but what is it that people want to consume, or what is it that people value, and then adding that value added. So it's not just the movie, it's the convenience, it's the availability, it's the cost structure and different ways of paying for things. So as opposed to paying one movie at a time, people are used to subscriptions now. So everything from movies to music to food to everything. So it's a lot of those different elements about how people shop, how people consume, and what the value is for people, that time, that effort. I think paying attention to those things helps you to stay relevant, in addition to just the technology.
And let's talk about some of the consumers. Who is it that's really supporting a lot of these retro comebacks?
I think that marketers always look to young generations, young consumers. So teens, and even earlier now, preteens and teens and 20-somethings really drive a lot of markets. And so what kind of becomes deemed cool or hip or is discovered, a lot of times trickles up, kind of filters up to broader populations. So a lot of times if you can appeal to that segment, and if they can be made to feel like they have discovered something on their own, and then it kind of organically spreads as a trend, or, you know, even a fad that kind of comes and goes, but a trend or a kind of direction, a lot of times that's what's gold for a brand.
Now, we know that obviously when it comes to trends, you think of social media. Talk about the role of social media in really reinvigorating some of these brands.
Yes. Oh, social media is really kind of It's a big equalizer, but it's a great vehicle for bringing back a lot of brands that were near extinction. And it's kind of now how people communicate. A lot of times this is what's more credible for consumers. Word of mouth has always been a really big influencer, much more than advertising, much more influential. So this just expands your word of mouth circle just more than tenfold. So social media is big, and then incorporating some things that have really kind of, I guess, sprung up organically that have become institutionalized, like Throwback Thursday. So that's when people share their pictures of them back in the day, whether for them that's the 80s or the 60s or what have you. I think that that brings a lot of things to light and keeps them relevant, or it brings things back. So if something is about to go extinct, like a Drake's Cakes or something that was on the brink of going away, or Twinkies. When Twinkies were there was talk that they were going to go away or go off the market, people kind of got up in arms and said,
right.
hey, we can't, this was part of my childhood, we can't let this go without a fight. And people can communicate, people can coalesce, people can get together and start a movement. And it's so much easier to do now with social media.
Hopefully a lot of these older brands are taking note. Thank you so much. Marlene Morris Towns there from Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business.